So, for those of you watching the recording, my name is Steve Fidelity. I'm the Director of Special Services, and this is expanding upon our previous conversation around restorative practices. In particular, today we're going to be approaching and investigating the life space crisis intervention. It is an evidence-based approach to dealing with adult-wary youth, and I will share the slide deck and post that as well for you all. And I also have 2 extra copies if anyone is feeling overly zealous and wants to take home and read, but I will walk you through this as well. And no, we don't want to do a software update right now. Oh, great, Sophie's back. For those of you who just joining us back on the Zoom, we do have our recording up, so you can just keep your camera and your microphone muted. But if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and join in. The reason I start with this opening slide is because our kids are experiencing something completely different than we did growing up. So I'd like to start with this quote that, when we're no longer able to change a situation, we need to look at how we change ourselves. And so often we look at our kids wanting to change them instead of saying, how can I change myself? So I think that's a really good starting point, is that the skills we're going to talk about, both through using restorative language, through using life space crisis intervention, isn't about changing our kids. It's about changing our practices, addressing our kids. So our goals for our session, I'm just going to see real quick. Just make sure if you're on the call that your mic is muted. That would be great. So our goals, which we're not going to cover all of today, is first we're going to explore shame. We're going to understand how we in conflict with our own kids, how we examine traditional versus LSCI inspired discipline, which has a restorative flair to it. We're going to probably expose ourselves to the 6 stages of LSCI, but then our next session will be really diving into it. So I start with, and again, for those of you who are just watching this for the first time, my background, recently received my master's in restorative practices, so I'm sharing a lot of the wonderful information I learned about interacting with other humans here with us today. So you'll notice some of these slides. So I'm a trainer of trainers for the IARP, so they allow us to use some of their curriculum, and that's where you see this from as well. One of the biggest perspectives, and like we talked about last week, restorative practices, a lot of it has to do with just changing the way we speak. It's not necessarily what we do, but how we speak. So one of the original hypotheses from the psychologist Brainwave talks about separating the deed from the doer, and it sounds at the surface level very simple. But when you think about and monitor your own language, it's very difficult. So for example, if you're frustrated at home with a kid, like, you can't believe talking to a partner, I can't believe so-and-so did that, they were so bad at dinner, right? Like, that's something that normally gets said. But what we're doing is we're not separating the deed from the doer. We're prescribing that badness to them as a person. So I remember just the other day, my little one, my 6-year-old, because I know she won't be on YouTube watching this later. But when I was tucking her into bed, she was a bad listener. She was a little headstrong during all of this, like, disrupted school schedules this week. And she's like, I'll try not to be so bad tomorrow. And I said, it's not that you were bad, it's that you are being a bad listener, but you were never bad. So when we talk about this little micro shift, it has the potential to make a big difference of what we're prescribing to, like, a personal static trait versus someone's behavior. And that goes a really long way, because we can address the fact that, like in my example, that my daughter was a bad listener, but that she's still empathetic, kind, caring, and loving. And that's what a lot of this restorative work does. A lot of the teachers have run with this already. So this is something that was shared with our school counselors last year. And it's called the compass of shame. And what the compass of shame does is it allows us to understand that when kids have their joy interrupted, they experience shame. So it's a little different from, the pop culture Brene Brown TED Talks on shame. If we think of the definition of shame as an interruption in our joy, we as humans respond in different ways. So we could attack others, we could attack ourselves, we could withdraw, or we could avoid things. Right? So if we're withdrawing, from a situation when we have that interruption in joy, we're isolating, we're running away, we're hiding ourselves. If we're attacking ourselves, it's where we have like our put downs and, we're kind of like punishing ourselves in our heads over and over again. Sometimes with the kid who attacks out at others, they're turning the tables and be like, well, it's my teacher's fault because she should have told me that I only had 20 minutes. And how was I supposed to know that? Blaming and lashing out at other people. And then at the bottom of the compass, we see this avoidance where we're denying that it even happened. Sometimes we avoid by, engaging in substance abuse or substance misuse or distracting ourselves in new ways. So because this is recorded, I'm not going to ask any of you to share out, but I'm just going to give you like 15 seconds of silence to think of a time when you've experienced shame. What is it like? Which compass, which side of the compass do you usually fall to when it comes to expressing shame? So I'll give you 10 minutes just to reflect, whether it's attacking others, withdrawing, attacking yourself, or avoidance. Silence is always awkward. I think as a school psychologist, you kind of get used to it. The reason we use the compass of shame is because what we're going to be talking about is how we intervene with kids and humans in conflict. Now, I want you to think about this. If you were dealing with someone, let's say it's your own kid. Typically, when we think about discipline and consequences, most of the time, if our kids have the same type of neurodevelopment, we tend to address them similarly. But what if you have one of your kids who every time they experience shame, they're putting themselves down? You have another kid who always attacks others. Well, maybe the kid who attacks others needs some sort of recognition that they're causing harm. But if you use that same strategy with the kid who's already putting themselves down, it's not going to work because they're already feeling really low and they're attacking themselves. So what we're going to talk about through LSCI is understanding how we need different strategies to be able to approach learners in different ways. So we need to understand ourselves first, how we respond to shame when it's introduced. We also need to understand how our kids experience shame. I can think of even amongst my own 3 kiddos, all 3 of them are at different corners of this compass. So the same strategy doesn't always work. And some of our school counselors have even shared this with our teachers, and they're like, oh, that makes so much more sense now. It's not that so-and-so is reacting because they want to interrupt your lesson, but there was an interruption in their joy. Now we need to know how to deal with it. And when we talk about shame, we think of probably growing up what it was like to experience shame. But there's actually 2 types of shame when you think about it. There's stigmatizing shame and there's reintegrative shame. Stigmatizing shame is the shame that pushes you out. So you think of your traditional approach to school discipline, right? Like expulsions, suspensions. It pushes you out of school community, it pushes you away. They've been labeled, go away from our community because it's not safe for you to be here. Whereas reintegrative shame is saying that there's some level of shame that's appropriate if you did something wrong. Like, yeah, you should feel bad if you made that mistake, if you called that kid an inappropriate name. Then how do we use that shame to call you back into community with the rest of your family at home or the rest of your class if you're doing this back at school? It acknowledges that we can be disappointed in that behavior, but still love and welcome that person back into our community. So it's very different. And we talk about that when we reflect on our roles of how we approach our kids in conflict and when we talk about how discipline is handled as well. So I will give you all the PDFs of this. So those of you that are here in person, you don't have to squint too much. What we're looking at the screen is the crisis conflict. And what ends up happening is up here, there's an event that happens. I will make up a purely hypothetical event. Let's say the event is I ask my child to take out the recycling because it's recycling day. There's a stressful event. my child will have feelings, anxieties about being asked to do something and interrupt their joy, right? Maybe they're playing video games before school. Now you've interrupted my joy, Dad, and I have to go out in 15-degree weather and drag out the recycling. They're going to exhibit some sort of behavior. A sigh, a rolling of the eyes. Can I do it later? Why do I have to do it? Why can't Dad do it?
Sounds familiar.
But this is where we come in. This is where we need to understand that we play a role in this, because that's where our reactions come into place. And I'll use myself as an example. I tend to over-assume responsibility for other people's emotions. Maybe that's why I became a director of special ed, because I want to make sure all our kids are taken care of, everyone's happy and well-suited. But I also then feel shame when I've upset one of my kids. So whoever's being asked to take out the trash is sighing, rolling their eyes, and they're upset. I get defensive. I'm like, come on, it's your chore. You shouldn't have to act that way. You do this every Wednesday. We have to take out the recycling. Well, all I've done is contributed to the stress, added a new incident, and see this cycle continue and spiral out of control. And what we're going to talk about through using life-based crisis intervention is how we recognize those situations and how we respond to them. But it's important to recognize that a big part of this cycle continuing is our reaction to how our kids are behaving. And I'm pitching this more towards the parent perspective, but it certainly applies within the classroom for teachers as well. We are contributors of the environment. So what I want you to do right now is to turn and talk with the people around you. I'll mute the microphone. And for those of you online, you can think to yourself just for like 60 seconds about characteristics of typical traditional punishment, about what that looks like. So we'll take a 60-second break, and you're all perfect. We got 6 of you. You can talk in pairs about what that characteristics looks like. And I'll mute. All right, so we had a good conversation going on here. And at the end, I asked the question, I said, is that helping or hurting your relationship with your kids? And well, it's hurting, but what else are you supposed to do? And I said, that's why we're here today. You'll see this in the handout, but when we look at this traditional system of punishment, I heard you all talk about taking things away, has more to do with consequences. There's a rigidity, right? We tend to apply that punishment regardless. We don't say, oh, Lisa responds this way on the compass of shame, so this should be my approach. It's typically the same consequence. It supports labeling. It doesn't talk about skill development, which is another one, right? Like when you think about me yelling at my kid to take out the recycling, I'm not helping them develop a system to recognize that on Wednesdays it's recycling and this is the can that needs to go out, and it harms that relationship. But what we're going to talk about is this LSCI, life-based crisis intervention inspired discipline, where it's helping them become autonomous. We talked about the same thing when it came to restorative questions. If the only reason that my child's going to take out the trash is because I yell at them every Wednesday morning, I am not helping create an autonomous human being that can do this for themselves. But through the use of LSCI, we're going to walk students, learners, children, these spouses, through this idea of understanding what's happening, identifying the conflict, and developing new skills to approach it. And that's going to help build kids up, right? I'm like, and if, instead I went to my kids like, I know it's Wednesday and you forgot, you know, but maybe what we could do is have a calendar downstairs. And when you come down each morning, you check it off, because you never forgot the calendar when you were getting Advent chocolate out for Christmas. maybe we could do the same thing and I could have on the calendar what can needs to go out that day to help remind you. Okay, Dad, like, do you see how that could be a much different outcome than my explosion back to them? One of the things that we talk about is how we respond. It's these small shift in semantics, and these excerpts are taken from this book, Talking with Kids in Conflict. And if anyone wants to borrow, feel free and just return them and we can share them back out again. This I put in here because I think this was really interesting for me about how I don't necessarily validate all the time my kids' experiences. So the example up here is like a kid saying like, I don't want to go to baseball. I can never hit the ball. And as a parent, you kind of assume that responsibility and you want to make it go away for your kids. So I might say to my kid, that's not true. The best ball players don't hit it all the time. You're wonderful in so many other areas. What I'm not doing is acknowledging how they're feeling at the time. Instead of saying like, you might be feeling frustrated, or maybe you're feeling anxious about it. Are you worried about what other kids might say? So it's this idea of how we validate the responses. This is really helpful for teachers if you have a disruptive kid in your class and they come in and they're like, I'm not doing any work today. And instead of the typical traditional discipline, right, would have been like, yes, you are, we're all going to work together and you're expected to sit in your seat and follow the same rules as everyone else. Whereas the LSCI approach would be like, well, Steve, it sounds like you got a lot going on today. Like maybe that's something we could talk about on the side after I get the class set up. But you can see how the traditional approach breaks down relationships, whereas the LSCI approach builds them up. Yeah, jump in.
Like the opposite of like a strike system.
Right? So I think with the strike system, it's kind of setting up expectations.
Right.
But there can be within the strike system, the humanity of how you approach it.
Right, and
The
acknowledge.
delivery of it.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it could be, I'm not doing any of that work today. Maybe that earns a strike for being disrespectful. But as a teacher, do I say like, up, Erica, that's a strike for you? Or do I say like, it sounds like you got a lot going on. And then we talk about it. And then after we go through the process, what do you think should be the consequence? Be like, well, one of our classroom agreements is that we're respectful of the teacher and I wasn't, so I probably should get a strike. So you get to the same point, but you're involving the learner in getting there.
Right.
So it's really there's small shifts. I don't want to say that there's anything radical here. But when we talk about, and this is, we just have a few more minutes, we're going to wrap this up. And then next week, we'll really dig into the next session, dig into the 6 stages. What we talked about last week was restorative practices. And the real difference there was stop asking your kids why they did something and ask them what happened. So that's very similar to the 6 stages. You see, I eliminated the first stage here because what restorative practices sometimes fails to capture is the first stage of LSCI, which is drain off. So I'm just going to recap what the stages are and wrap up and take any questions for today. But LSCI comes in and there needs to be drain off. And I've even seen where I've gone wrong with this as a parent, as a clinician. I could think back to, even like one time I was doing a risk assessment and a child was so upset that we were going to call their mom. We went into the what happened. But unless you would allow for that emotion to drain off, you're not going to be able to have a reasonable conversation. They talk about like from a neurobiological perspective that the brain flips. You start using a different part of your brain when you're feeling dysregulated. That's more of like your lizard brain. And you need that emotionality to calm down to be able to use the part of your brain that engages in actual reasoning. So that's why the first stage of LSCI is that drain off piece. Oh, it sounds like you're feeling anxious. Like, yeah, that's a big test. I understand why you might be feeling that way. That validation, that reflective listening, not responding personally to their aggression. And then after you've gotten the drain off, that's where you can start walking them through a timeline. This, I imagine, will be really effective too as our kiddos, and I say our kiddos because our kids are much the same age now, but as they get older and start partying and going out, it's almost like it could be used for the interrogation tactics as well. But stage 2 is structuring a timeline with them. So many times, especially with kids with special needs and even neurotypical people, we have constructed a timeline that reinforces and protects ourselves. But then when you have someone who's well regulated, allowed you to drain off that emotionality and say, well, Steve, walk me through what happened. It's like, well, I woke up this morning and I'm ready to walk out the door for school, and dad just sprung upon me that I had to take the trash out. It's like, well, wait a second. What day of the week was it? Well, it was Wednesday. Like, why does that matter? What happens every Wednesday? I don't know. I have practice after school, right? But what happens in the morning? I think Wednesday's on the calendar as recycling day. And what's your responsibility with the family? To take out the recycling? So was this really dad springing it on you, or was this something you forgot? So only after you go through the emotional drain off can you go back and at a really minuscule level develop a specific timeline that allows them to be enlightened. And when they get to that enlightenment, the third stage is they see what the central issue was. Central issue was, I forgot. The insight is knowing to how we can move forward and maintain the accountability. And then we work on the development of new skills. So what are some things that we could teach you? Well, since I seem to be forgetting that a lot, maybe I need something else to help remind me what day of the week it is and what I'm doing. Well, you're on your phone a lot in the morning, texting all your friends. Would it be helpful if we put that in your calendar on your phone or something on your door? Working through with them those new skills and then transfer that learning to other experiences. So you can see emotional drain off, go through the timeline, figure out what the central issue is and the insight, develop new skills and transfer it. You can see how that's really different from the way I reacted in the beginning, right? Like, it's Wednesday, you take the recycling out every Wednesday. Why haven't you done it yet? I used that example because that happened this past week. And after we went through that and the recycling was taken out, my wife calls me and said the recycling men already came and now our child has to bring it back up to the house, which led to like a whole nother conflict cycle, right? If we go back to that conflict, unresolved conflict issue, like just when you thought that incident was done, the next incident comes up, which is that we missed the garbage man, and now we've got to take it back up to the house. But what I really love is next week, what I want to do is get us into maybe some small groups to go through and understand the different stages of LSCI. And if we want, maybe even for our last session, we could even engage in some role playing to walk through it. But I really do think this is a transformational way to approach parenting, to approach teaching. And at the end of the day, you're developing skills for our kids to be able to take to new experiences, which is much different than needing mom or dad there to, stop the hand and keep them going. So I will pause there for the presentation. Any questions, comments, concerns, how this relates to restorative practices, teaching, or anything from the home front? And I'll take questions. What I'll do is I'm going to stop the recording just so that if people have questions that are more personal, that we don't share that out with the YouTube folks. So let me end the recording, which is hidden in my, there it is.